Hello, my zebras and spoonies. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me today. I'm glad that you're here. Today, I'm going to be talking about the myth of binary gender. Let's first start by talking about the fact that biological sex is not the same as gender. What causes some confusion in the general public is the use of biological sex and gender as interchangeable terms when they're really not. They don't refer to the same thing. Biological sex is usually determined by our karyotype or your genetics. There are other factors that come into play, and we'll talk about that later. Gender is mostly used for cultural behaviors, such as what is considered appropriate for dress, what is considered appropriate manners, signs of deference, etc., that differentiate between the two sexes. Gender itself is not entirely a social construct as there are physical differences, but there are a lot of this that is defined through our folkways, which are behaviors that are learned and shared by a social group that we often refer to as customs in a group, and they are not really morally significant, but they can be super important for social acceptance. And these can vary quite a bit between different cultures, and yet they dictate the way that humans behave. And there are a lot of folkways that dictate the rules of gender. It's interesting because when you look at social norms, we break these things down into folkways, mores, taboo, and laws. And the concept of gender fall into all of these categories. So let's kind of look at that and break that down. Folkways are those behaviors that are learned and shared by a social group. Folkways are the ways that we are expected to behave, and this is usually enforced with what we would call peer pressure. An example of this is the idea that certain colors are for certain genders. Pink is for girls and blue is for boys. The peer pressure comes when you break that social custom, when you break that practice. It comes as teasing, shunning, bullying, shaming. This kind of response from our peer group makes it readily apparent that we have broken a folkway and that that our society isn't liking it. If we want to fit in with the group and be accepted, then we'll have to change our behavior. Mores are norms of morality, and these are a concept of what is right and wrong. There's definitely things that are wrapped up in gender and is usually around relationships, like what is ethically okay for in our relationships, like who should be having relationships and who we should be dating and who should we be having sex with is all wrapped up in our cultural mores. And of course, this is absolutely wrapped up in our concepts of this social definition of what gender is. Then we have taboos. These are the things that are completely forbidden in a culture and will come with some pretty heavy social consequences. Think about the history of the way that we've looked at menstruation and how menstruation was a time that women were set aside and set apart. Look at the way that gay people have been treated for their relationships. People used to be killed for that. Unfortunately, they sometimes still are killed for that. There's absolutely taboos in our culture that are wrapped around and centered on our ideas of gender. From all of these folkways, mores, and taboos, we often end up with laws surrounding our ideas of gender. We have laws about who can get married. We have laws about whether or not transgender people can go into particular bathrooms. We have laws about all kinds of stuff surrounding gender, and it's kind of fascinating when you think about gender being a social construct. It's important for us to really understand that gender is primarily a social construct, that what we can because of that, we can change these folkways, mores, and taboos, leading to changes in our laws. This is why it is so important to vocally challenge these ideas of binary gender. Okay, so why am I 100% convinced that binary gender is a myth? Let's go back to sex, the biology of a human. Our sex is primarily but not exclusively determined by our DNA, by our karyotypes. So we know scientifically without question that humans are not born just male or female. We know that XX and XY are not the only options when we are looking at a genetically viable offspring. There are six karyotypes that are really common, and those include XX and XY. There's about 1 in 2,000 that have Turner syndrome, which is they only represent a single X. Then there's people with Kiflner syndrome, and they are double XY, and they're right around 1 in 1,000. So that's pretty common. We also have X double Y, which is roughly 1 in 1,000, and we have triple X, Y, which is roughly 1 in 18,000. X double Y happens about 1 in 1,000. There are a lot of variation, but those are the most common. XX, XY, X, double XY, X double Y, and triple XY. What's really astounding to me in all of this is that about 1 in 100 people, so about 1% of the human population, is what we call intersex. So these are people who scientifically are not the classic XX or XY, that they have some other type of genetic presentation, which we define as intersex. So if 1% of the human population is genetically intersex, that absolutely eliminates the myth that there's only two possibilities of gender. While 1% isn't a huge portion of the population, it's enough to add up to a lot of people. With the current world population, this 1% represents 78 million people who are intersex. That's a lot of people. But biology is never straightforward or simple on our sex. It is just no different. To make things even more complicated, there is androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the mother's biology will affect the development of the fetus. And this is where you can end up with an individual who has the genetic XY, but ends up presenting XX. And this is because that one of two factors. Either the mother isn't capable of providing the fetus with the testosterone necessary to trigger the testosterone cascade to produce a male offspring, or the fetus is insensitive to that testosterone. If the fetus is insensitive due to a lack of its genetic Y, then despite the presence of testosterone, the fetus does not develop XY traits. There is also partial androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the testosterone has some effects on sex development, and the fetus develops traits that are often not what we would expect for boys or girls by the standard binary gender definitions. The reality is, in the world of biology, sex is complicated and has a lot of variation. There isn't this binary one or the other kind of option. And when we think about the fact that our biology has this degree of variability, it only makes sense that our gender should also have a corresponding degree of variability because, of course, the human mind, which is driven by our biology, would be as diverse as our genetics. It's kind of ludicrous to think that our gender is binary when our genetics are not. So, yeah, I think that we need to get off this idea that it's an either or option. So, yeah, thanks for coming and hanging out with me today. Until we talk again, you stay well, and I'll see you later. Bye.